hosting me this evening. I'm certainly excited to be a part of this. As you can kind of tell just a little bit from this slide that I've been into frogs for a really long time. I am a 2015 graduate of the Maine Master Naturalist program. And as mentioned, I teach biology and environmental science. But really frogs have been with me my whole life. And as a kind of note there, my nieces and nephews actually call me Uncle Bullfrog. That's my, that's my nickname to the extended family. There's a picture of with a frog. In fact, I'd like to share with you, if I may, if you can see this here, this is a library card from my elementary school. And you can see this is it's a field guide to reptiles and amphibians. And you can see how many times my name is listed, Bryce, when this is back in the late 80s when we used library cards, but it shows how interested I was, literally my entire life. And so it's a subject I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you this evening. And we're going to kind of do a brief run through on amphibians, and frogs in general. And then we're going to take a little bit of a narrower dive into the frogs of the state of Maine, and kind of where frogs are, how they're doing right now in the world a little bit. And then we will segue to some questions and answer at the end of that. So, well, let's just go ahead and jump right in then. Let's see here. Trying to go to the next slide. Fortunately, here we go. Okay, here we go. Yeah, is that amphibians really, more than probably just about any set of animals out there, really kind of, I think in their lifespans or their life cycles, really embrace this idea of evolution, of change over time. And it was about 385 million years ago that the first vertebrates left the water. These were fish-like animals, and they came onto land. And to make that transition from the water to the land was not easy. There's many adaptations that have to be made in order to make that happen. One is that you have your eyes have to be really changed in order to see out on a dry land, and frogs actually have two eyelids, not one like us, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as a product of that, of being able to go both on land and in the water. They also have to have supportive limbs. Fins do not help you when you're out on land. You need to have limbs that can hold you up and you can move about with, and so that was definitely a change. And you also have to be able to breathe. Gills are not going to help you when you're out on land. And so you either have to have lungs by which you can take oxygen directly from the air, or you have to have skin by which you can have natural gas exchange. And we have amphibians in the state of Maine. They're able to do both of those. And then, at least you have to have some. And even as we move forward from amphibians into reptiles later on, you have to have skin that will prevent water loss. And then later on, when we evolved into reptiles, eggs that do not dehydrate out of water. Frogs do have to return to the water to breed. That is something they are affixed to. There's no way around that, and that's something we're going to get into here just in a moment. So let's talk a little bit about taxonomy in terms of amphibians in the state of Maine. So we're going to use an example, the American toad. If you find a toad in the state of Maine, it is going to be the American toad. I guess we do have the Fowler's toad that will occasionally cross our state border, but by and large, if you find a toad in the state of Maine, it is going to be the American toad. And so let's use that as our example to go through and understand kind of the entire taxonomy using this as an example. So as a domain, frogs and toads, they are eukaryotes, which means they have organelles like a nucleus and mitochondria, those kinds of things. The kingdom they belong to are the animals. They're not fungi, they're not plants. The phylum that they belong to are the chordates, the chordata, so which means they have a backbone. The class that they are a part of are are the amphibians, amphibia, to separate them from birds and mammals and other types of chordates. And then the order is the anurids, and anura are the frogs and the toads, and that distinguishes them from the other amphibians that we have, which we'll talk about in a moment here. And then the family is the toad family, which is the Buffinidae for the American toad. And then the genus is Bufo. And then the species is Americanus for the American toad. So going right, again, from domain all the way to species, using that as kind of an example. And just to give you a little bit of taxonomy 101 there, using one of our most common species of frogs and toads here in the state of Maine, probably one you've maybe even seen in your own yard or in your own garden, the American toad. So let's talk a little bit about amphibians here. As said, it's a class of many different types of species. Here in the state of Maine, we have, of the 3 orders of amphibians, we only have 2 of them. We have the frogs and toads, which are the anurans, which I mentioned a moment ago, and then we have the quadata, which are the salamanders. The frogs and toads, we have here in Maine, we have 9 different species. We're going to talk about each of them here in just a moment. And then the salamanders, we have 9 different species of them as well. And then we have a third order, which you may not be all that familiar with. It's the Gymnophonia, and those are the caecilians. And these are worm-like amphibians. They're not nearly as many species, not nearly as many numbers, and they're confined to the tropics. And we certainly don't have any in the state of Maine. I don't think we even have any in the United States in general. But this gives you a little bit of breakdown of the amphibians that we have here in Maine. So here's a photo I wanted to share with you. Our family, we had a small little, about, I don't know, 8-foot by 8-foot frog pond that we basically just dug out and lined and just put in our yard. And usually after a summer rain, some American toads find their way to that frog pond, and they'll do that long trill sound of sound that they make, and it's pretty loud, and they usually start around 10:30 at night, kind of about the same time we're looking to go to sleep, and then they'll keep it up for several hours. And usually it's at that point that I go down and try to find the toad and relocate it. And so I'll bring a headlamp down there, and the pond is so small, again, it's like 8 feet by 8 feet. Usually it doesn't take very long to find it, and when they do, they give me that same look I get every time, which is, you're really messing with my game. I'm looking to make some tadpoles, and here you are with a big shiny light taking me out of my element. And so this is an image that I've seen a few times, so I wanted to share that with you. The amphibian life cycle of those, particularly those of frogs, is something we're probably all quite familiar with. As I mentioned a moment ago, the eggs of amphibians tend to be located in the water, and so they have they're jelly-like eggs, and that's how they make their start in life. Usually, with the after fertilization in the spring. It's external fertilization, actually. Even though males and females do get together, the female actually releases the eggs first, and then the male frog will fertilize the eggs after they've left the female's body in the water. And so it's external fertilization, and the eggs are right there in the water, which then when they break out of an egg, they don't break out of the egg as a frog, they break out of the egg as a tadpole, which to a large extent looks like a little fish. They've got gills, they've got kind of a tail-like fin. And then depending on which species of frog we're talking about, they will start to develop their limbs, and they actually will use the energy by the decreasing size of the tail, and essentially reabsorb that into the development of limbs. And usually it's the hind limbs that come first, followed by the forelimbs, and then the gills start to make way for the development of lungs. And over time, the tail continues to dwindle in size, just as the limbs continue to grow and the lungs continue to develop. And and then it becomes what we call a froglet, which is a very young frog. And at that point, it's ready to leave the water and start its second chapter of life. And so give you a little bit of a natural history here, 101 of frogs. Question that sometimes comes up is, yeah, why do frogs have long legs? And the reason is that, and if you notice, a lot of times frogs tend to be right on the interface between land and water. They're right on the side of a pond. And that's strategic on their part because they're kind of mid-grade in terms of where they sit on the food chain. They will certainly eat insects and minnows and other small invertebrates for food, but then they get preyed upon by possibly large turtles or birds, snakes. So they have threats coming from a multitude of different directions, some of them from the water, some of them from the land. And if that threat is coming from the water, maybe coming from, like, say, a turtle or something, then they can jump from right there on the bank of the water toward the land to get away. If they find a threat that's coming from the land, then they can jump into the water and escape the threat that might be coming from the land. So the idea then is to be right there in the interface, and then by one quick jump, you're able to escape whatever threat might be coming your way. Another question is, like, why do frogs have these bulbous eyes that kind of sit on top of their heads? We humans have our eyes set inside forward facing, but frogs, their eyes are positioned quite differently. And there's some good reason for that. One is they want to be able to keep their eyes above the water. If they're trying to see something that's going on above water, they have an opportunity to do that very easily. A second is that if you notice, the frogs don't have much in the way of a neck. They can't turn their head back up and down, back and forth. So the ability to see have as much range, either be able to find prey or not to become prey from an approaching predator, gives them a great deal of visibility. So having those eyes on top of their heads really serves them quite well in terms of their ability to escape and to survive. As I mentioned a moment ago, frogs don't have one set of eyelids like we do. They have two sets of eyelids. Those the kind of the external ones, like we have, which we open up when we want to look at, when we want to see when we're outside. But then when you go under the water, they actually have an internal set of eyelids, which actually act like goggles. Which gives them the ability to see underwater. And so that's pretty neat. They have that adaptation in order to do that, because they do need to be able to see both on land, in the water, and those two sets of eyelids allows them that kind of flexibility. How can frogs go so long without being able to come up for air to breathe? They can certainly go underwater much longer than we can. To a large extent, is they are able to breathe to bring in some oxygen through their skin, and that gives them that ability to kind of hold on under the water much longer than we can. But that also is a real challenge. That also means that if there is any pollution in the water, it is going to go directly into their body. And so they're very, very susceptible to changes in the natural environment. They're kind of like the canaries in the coal mine in some respects. If there is something in the environment that is less than favorable, they're going to have the greatest degree of impact felt first, because that barrier, again, between the outside environment and the sensitive internal organs is much thinner than it is for many of the other animals that are out there. And so, as I said, where do frogs sit on or stand on the food chain? Again, they're about midway up and down. And so they have, again, they have things that they're eating at lower on the food chain, but then there's certainly many animals that are out would love to make a frog their food. And so they are constantly, in trying to avoid becoming prey and also seeking out prey for themselves and their own meals. There are some really interesting and strange frogs out there in the world, I must say. A few that I'd like to just talk a moment about. One is called the Darwin's frog. The Darwin's frog, which is found in South America, and what it does is that when the female lays eggs in the tropics, the dad frog, the father frog, will follow her and essentially gobble up the eggs, put them into his mouth. But he doesn't digest them. He does not swallow them. He keeps them in his vocal sac. And what he's really doing is he's protecting them from what would be predators. And those frogs, those eggs, develop into tadpoles and then actually develop into little baby frogs. And then when they developed into little baby frogs, the father frog will literally open his mouth and little baby froglets will jump out of his mouth. It's remarkable how they're able to do that. Another one that has a really interesting kind of parental care, if you will, is the Suriname toad, another species from South America, where the female Suriname toad, after she lays her eggs, and she will usually do it in the water, she will actually use her back legs and actually kind of scoop up the back legs and put them on her back. And she will have, many eggs on her back. And then over time, skin actually grows over the eggs. And so she actually gets this like humpback. And what she's doing is kind of like the father frog of the Darwin's frog. She's protecting her young during the most vulnerable moment in their lives. And when they develop into tadpoles, they actually will start breaking out of her back. And so it's really weird to see these little tadpoles starting to pierce their way and move their way out of their back. It's like some weird sci-fi movie or something, really bizarre. Another interesting frog is the flying frog, which lives in India, and they have they have kind of big, wide fingers, and they have this big webbing in between their fingers. And what they will do is they will jump from tree to tree, and they will use the kind of the spread out digits on their feet and kind of, I guess you call it the forelimbs of their hands. And then they will use that as gliders to get from one, to jump from maybe one leaf of one tree to another leaf. Really remarkable stuff. Another one is the glass frog, which is a frog found in Central America. And the back of the frog is kind of a light green color for most of these species. But then if you flip them over on their belly, they almost really live up to their name. They have this transparent skin. And you can look inside and you can see the heart pumping. You can see the blood going through the veins. You can see food being digested. It is a truly remarkable thing to see. It's like, maybe we say we don't have to dissect frogs if you have a glass frog, because you can see it all without having to cut anything open, because you can see everything going on in there. It's remarkable. They have that ability. Another really interesting frog, which is also found in South America, I think it's in the country of Chile, if I recall, it's the black boulder frog. And this is a species that lives on the sides of mountains and on hills. And when a would-be predator comes up to them, what they will do is they will kind of curl themselves up into a ball and literally roll down the hill. And then they literally will bounce. They almost have kind of a rubberized capacity. They can kind of bounce from off of things, and they'll just roll their way down to the bottom base of the hill, and then once they feel like they're safe, they'll come back up and go back into motion. It's really wild how they have that ability to do that. And another one that was kind of interesting is called the bird poop frog. Certainly we all know that camouflage is a good way of keeping yourself away from again, would-be predators. And the bird poop frog, as its name indicates, literally camouflages itself by looking like bird poop. It might be the only or one of the very few animals in the animal kingdom where if it's being said, you really look like shit, well, that is actually quite a bit of a compliment, because that means it's very, very well camouflaged. So again, just remarkable sets of animals that we have throughout the world. And we're going to get into some of those that we have here in the state of Maine. Here in terms of the distribution of amphibians, depending on what part of the state you live in, we will find anywhere between 12 to 17 different species. And there's kind of a band, as you can see, that kind of runs through the center of our state that is the highest concentration of species. But by and large, we have a pretty good number of amphibians, both frogs and of salamanders throughout the state of Maine. And you can see kind of the frequency of records found there. So I just want to provide just a little bit of anatomy here, kind of anatomy 101 of frogs. And so, as you probably know, as we talked about their wonderful jumping ability, so their hind limbs are much longer than their forelimbs by and large. And that's, again, gives them that ability to jump so well. Is also, you can tell, but they have very big eyes, but then behind the eyes is what's called a tympanic membrane. And the tympanic membrane gives them the ability to hear. Frogs were really the first vertebrates to really be able to make calls, to really have a sound. And if you have a call, you need a vocal sac to make noise, but then you need to have something that can hear the sound on the other side. And so frogs definitely have this tympanic membrane that allows them to hear each other. And it's also a good way to distinguish the male frogs from female frogs, depending on the species, because in some cases that tympanic membrane is much larger from one sex to the other, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Some of the species have these called dorsolateral folds that run down both sides of their bodies. And that has some glandular tissue. It also may provide some degree of being a little bit hydrodynamic. And then also you can see there that frogs don't have a whole lot in the way of ribs, but they have very extended pelvic bones. And it's all part of their anatomy. And I would say that they also have a very large mouth relative to the size of their bodies. And so these are just kind of some general anatomy of frogs. So frogs play a big part of our culture. These are just, there's The Princess and the Frog. There's a movie that came out several years ago called Frog. There's Frog and Toad Are Friends. There's a 1970s kind of a sci-fi horror movie called Frogs. Why that one only got 6% on Rotten Tomatoes, I have no idea. But there's frogs play an indelible role in our culture. That is for sure. I think we resonate with them. They're kind of their cute little precocious faces, and so we resonate with them in a number of different ways in terms of our culture and fiction and literature and so forth. So let's talk just a moment here about the species of frogs that we have here in the state of Maine. And here in Maine, we have, as I said, 9 different species. And the first one we're going to talk about is the spring peeper. The spring peeper is our smallest frog and probably our loudest frog, which is kind of sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, but it is the case. You notice that the Pseudacris, that's their genus name, which is the same genus as the chorus frogs, which are a series of species. We find more of them out in the Midwest and the West. This is the only, I guess you'd say, chorus frog that we have here in Maine. But the species name is crucifer, and crucifer, like crucifix, means the one who bears a cross. And if you notice on the back side of the spring peeper, there literally is a cross that goes across its back. It's probably one of the most common vertebrates in Maine, second only to the redback salamander. The skin can lighten and darken a little bit for camouflage purposes. They're also pretty good at tolerating freezing temperatures, and their bodies can actually become frozen for as much as 2 weeks at a time, which also means they're one of the first species to come out of hibernation, or the equivalent, which is brumation for reptiles and amphibians, where they go into even a deeper state of torpor, if you will, during the winter months. So I'd like to give you now the call of the spring peeper. It's a call you're all probably familiar with. So that is a very, very peep peep sound, one that we will probably be hearing in the next couple of weeks as they come out of brumation. The next one I'd like to share with you is the wood frog. the wood frog is, you can see there, it's got one of those dorsolateral folds there going down each side of its back. And it also has this dark mask you can see behind the eye that goes over the tympanic membrane, which is very identifiable. This is actually the only species of frog that lives above the Arctic Circle. If you look at its range, it goes way above, I mean, way up into northern Canada and northern parts of Alaska, Canada, as certainly throughout the state of Maine. They are incredibly well adapted for cold temperatures. They have a biological antifreeze, kind of a glycerol that allows them to survive in cold temperatures. Not that I'd ever recommend anyone doing this, but if you wanted to watch on YouTube, people have actually put them in a freezer and they will freeze solid, and you put them on a towel and they can actually come back to life. It's remarkable. They're able to basically keep all of the liquid part of the blood kind of coagulates right around the heart, and then they kind of allow the rest of the body to freeze. And they only will burrow just a couple of inches under the ground where the ground is still frozen. And they come out very, very early in the spring. So they should be coming out very, very soon, perhaps as early as this weekend. And they will breed again, still sometimes when there's still partial ice on the ponds that the vernal pools that they are breeding in. They'll only breed in vernal pools. They will not breed in stationary ponds that have fish and things like that. They will only breed in those vernal pools. So they're very, very selective in that regard. And as a product of that, because those vernal pools are eventually going to shrink up in size as we go in from the spring and into the summer, so their tadpoles will metamorphose very, very quickly. And they come in for one big, called the big night. They breed very, very quickly, explosive breeders in the early spring, and then they kind of go out into the forest and spend the rest of their summer kind of in moist undergrowth in the forest. And so with that, I'd like to give you the call of the wood frog.
Hey, Bryce, before you play
Yes.
it, I think some folks had some difficulty hearing the spring peeper as well.
Oh,
so after
okay.
we play the wood frog.
I'll go back to the peeper in a moment then.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you. So yeah, here is
I was not able to hear that. I'm not sure if there's.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Not at all?
I could not hear it. I don't know if folks want to put in the chat if they could make sure I'm not the only one.
Okay. Okay.
Yep, I'm here. I guess we're all having a little difficulty hearing it. Sorry about that.
No. Yeah, I'll try one more time. I'll try to put it right up, and if I can't, then maybe it's yeah. I'm not sure why that's the case, because it's about as loud as my voice.
Right. Let's try one more time.
I'll try one more time and just see.
There's a new Zoom adaptation that blocks out other sounds in your voice.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you have to turn that off. I don't know if that's what it is, but I'm just saying.
Oh,
okay. That might be what's going on then. Okay. Yeah. What I can do is that there actually is a free app you can get called Frog Sound, and you can pull up all of these. So we may not be able to do them here, but yeah, there's an easy app that you can get a chance to hear all of these. So let's go ahead and move on to our next species here. We'll now get into the northern leopard frog. This is sometimes we call them laboratory frog. Most of the frogs that we dissected in biology class in high school were leopard frogs. I have a picture there from the movie E.T. If you remember that scene where they released the frogs from being dissected, those were all leopard frogs. Sometimes we call it the meadow frog because it's because a lot of times they're found in meadows. After they breed, they kind of stay in kind of wet grassy areas. You can probably imagine why this species is called the leopard frog, is because they literally have spots like a leopard. They also, you can see they have those dorsolateral folds. Sometimes they get confused with the pickerel frog, which we'll talk about in just a moment here. They used to be the most common species of frog in the United States. When I was a kid, that was the case, but climate change, pollution, the chytrid fungus, habitat loss have done, unfortunately, some real damage to the species. They're certainly still can be found, but not in the same numbers that they could maybe 30 or 40 years ago. The next piece I'd like to show you is that pickerel frog. And you can see why it's sometimes confused with the leopard frog. It has spots on it, on it down its back and on the side, but usually those spots are not as circular. They're more squarish, and they tend to fit more of a standard two lines that run down their back, which is a good way to distinguish it from the leopard frog. They're pretty widespread throughout the state of Maine, and they have kind of a bright or orangish under their legs, and that indicates there's toxicity there. They do have some poison glands. In fact, if you were to put the pickerel frog in a bucket with the other species of frogs that we have here in the state of Maine, it could well kill them because that poison would get into through their skins and into their bodies. And so that's the pickerel frog. Again, another species found throughout the state of Maine. And then here's our American toad again that we talked about. And the American toad is very common here in the state of Maine. They're pretty comfortable coming into people's yards and gardens and things like that. Is there a toad? They're rough and warty. By the way, biologically, there is technically no difference between frogs and toads. That's more of a human distinction rather than a biological one. They do have these kind of bean-shaped parotid glands behind their eyes, which actually helps with some toxic secretions that they can release. And so that's how they kind of that's their defense mechanism. They're not nearly as agile as many of the frogs. They don't jump as far. They're a little slower. They tend to get further away from the water, so they don't just necessarily jump right into the water. And the breeding males tend to have these enlarged thumb pads, which they will use to help kind of latch on to females during breeding. Their tadpoles tend to be quite small and black in color. So that's our one real toad in the state of Maine, or the American toad. And then we have one real true tree frog in the state of Maine, and that is the gray tree frog. And they're about twice the size of the spring peeper. The spring peeper gets about a little over an inch long. The spring peeper, or should say the gray tree frog, get about 2.5 inches in length. So as a tree frog, they have those really cool adhesive toe pads, even have adhesive belly skin, which allows them to cling on to, obviously, to trees and to other surfaces as well. If you notice, the species name here is versicolor, which means the ability to change color. So you can see from that one photo there below, they can be a gray, obviously, gray tree frog, but they can also become a green color as well, which again helps them to camouflage. They will brumate. Again, that's kind of the reptile amphibian equivalent of hibernation near the surface, under roots and logs and leaves. They don't go that far underneath the soil to brumate, which means they can tolerate cold temperatures pretty well. And they can tolerate up to 21 degrees Fahrenheit, as low as 21 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 5 days, because they have that kind of glycerol that prevents fluids around the cells from freezing, which is pretty remarkable that they have that capacity. Now on to the green frog. Probably when most of us think of that iconic green frog sitting on the side of a pond, it's a lot of times we think of it's the green frog, and that they have the dorsolateral folds running down its back. It's obviously green in color, and they have you can see that tympanic membrane behind the eye. If the tympanic membrane is about twice the size of the eye, that indicates it's a male. And if it's about the same size as the eye, then that indicates that it's a female. And you can see the one on the top there, that would be a male green frog. The one on the bottom is a female green frog. So they seldom venture too far from the water. As I said, that they have those dorsolateral folds that run a good portion of the way down their back. Now that leads us to the American bullfrog, which is the largest frog in not only in the state of Maine, but is the largest native frog in the United States as well. They're native to this area, but they have actually been invasive to many other places, both in the western part of the United States, because they have really big legs that people have used for food, for frog legs. But the American bullfrog is also quite agile, and they can escape. And they will breed. And actually, in western parts of the United States, they are so prolific. They have actually, and they're also they'll eat just about anything. They'll eat birds and mice and other species of frogs. And so they've actually done quite a bit of damage to some of the western species that are found out there because they have, again, escaped frog farms that people have tried to breed. The males are very territorial. They will actually sometimes wrestle each other for turf along the side of the pond to get access to the females. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's this chytrid fungus, which we'll talk a little bit about, which is a fungus which has been killing frogs around the world. The American bullfrog it's a vector. It carries the chytrid fungus, but it doesn't seem to affect them in terms of their health. So they're actually good at unfortunately spreading the chytrid fungus that has done a lot of damage to other species of frogs around the United States and really around the world as well. And they're actually a game species. You can here in Maine, you can actually have a license to hunt them, and people do that again because to a large extent because their legs, very long, powerful, muscular legs, are also a food source for folks. And then we have the mink frog. The mink frog, sometimes called the frog of the north. If you can see its range, the southern part of its range is further north than any other species that we have here in North America. And they're kind of a secretive species. They're certainly the most aquatic. Rarely do we ever find one on land. Usually you might see them sitting on water lilies and things like that. And again, they're really only found in the northern part of the state of Maine. Not really found in the southern part. We find that they really like to be in water that's a little colder in its temperature, a little bit more oxygen rich. They seem to need to have a little bit more oxygen in the water. And if anyone ever picks one up, they kind of emit a musky scent, which is where their name comes from. So apparently it smells like mink. I'm not sure how many of us spend a lot of time holding mink either as an animal, but they kind of like raw onions, probably the best way to describe it. But they will brumate in mud under permanent bodies of water. Again, they're really just found more in the northern part of the state of Maine than anywhere else. But yeah, globally, unfortunately, this has been a really tough time for amphibians. Since the 1980s, since when I was a little kid, the world has seen massive declines of localized amphibian species. And today, over 40%, 43% of amphibians are now threatened with extinction. And there's a number of reasons of why that's the case. Habitat loss certainly has taken a toll, and as well as climate change. These are very, very sensitive species. So if the environment should change, and it doesn't have to change much, they're going to have a lot of times they have a little bit harder time making those adjustments. And so those permeable skins make them very, very susceptible, particularly to pollution. Because as I said, if there's pollution in the water, it may not affect like a reptile that has a water resistant skin, but to an amphibian where they can go directly through their skin, that can do an enormous amount of damage. And then, as I said, kind of the death knell to some extent is this chytrid fungus, which is it's a fungus that can just be spread. It's microscopic. It's spread in the water. It can go through the skin. Again, those permeable skins of amphibians, and it causes them to become lethargic. They will lose appetite, and they'll ultimately have a heart attack and die, which is really, really tragic, to say the least. And so you can see there's a picture of some out west of yellow-legged frogs. I think this was a photo taken in California where, the year before, there was just prolific numbers of yellow-legged frogs, and they come back the next year and the chytrid fungus has just done, incredible amounts of damage. Fortunately, we have a lot of great people out there trying to help out amphibians, and maybe you've seen a street sign like this, for amphibian crossing. Pretty soon, they're going to be, again, coming out of brumation. They're going to be crossing roads, working their way to that vernal pool or pond in order to breed. And fortunately, there's people out there who can help stop traffic and help these animals get to safe harbor where they need to breed. And so that's great that there's a lot of people out there committed to doing that, which is absolutely wonderful. And so, yeah, so are there any, I kind of open it up. That was kind of my little spiel there on frogs, and both kind of around the world, but also here home in the state of Maine. And with that, I would happy to open up to any questions that anyone might have.
Great, thank you, Bryce. We have been collecting some questions here, and there are quite a few questions, and I think you touched on it, of the decline of frog populations. And one question that I had was for the fungus in particular. Has there been any observations of any cycles with that fungus? Because I know there are some ponds here in Maine where you'll see large populations of frogs all die out, but then slowly kind of come back. Have you heard about or observed this yourself?
I have seen some places where population numbers will change. I think to your point, you have to kind of take a longer view to see, is this just kind of a one-year anomaly, or is this a broader trend line? And I know that the chytrid fungus, it does exist here in the state of Maine. I don't, as far as I know, has not done the kind of damage that we have seen it do in places like Central and South America, where the habitat looks entirely pristine. There's no reason why frogs should be dying, and then it's gone silent because there just aren't any anymore. But chytrid does exist. I know that we have lost some frogs to the chytrid fungus, and yeah. So I mean, I think that there's, again, all the things that we've talked about, have the potential to do damage to not only to frogs around the world, but here in the state of Maine. As I said, like the mink frog, which tends to be better acclimated to a little bit colder waters or cooler waters. The southern part of its range tends to run through central and northern Maine, and so as the temperatures continue to increase, that might push that range further and further north. And species that are usually found a little bit more southern parts of the state, like bullfrogs, I think have historically not been at the northern part of Aroostook County. Now with warming temperatures, they're working their way up, and there's been some examples where bullfrogs have been known, because again, they're voracious carnivores, have been known to eat mink frogs and other species. So and they will eat leopard frogs. They will eat other species as well. So again, those kinds of conditions, and they're a little bit more generalists, I think, and so that's an issue that we're seeing as well. But yeah, I think pollution, habitat loss, climate change, chytrid, all of these factors play a role, unfortunately, in being potential threats, I think. But in terms of, if you want to really look at, is this a permanent problem, or is this a temporary one? You probably can't make a designation usually in 1 year alone. Usually need a few years to kind of see if there's a larger trend line there.
Excellent. We have some questions about different questions about frog habitat, and one question was for vernal pools is, how does the snowpack affect vernal pools? I know that some frogs will utilize those for mating, and does having snow affect it, or perhaps not having a lot of snow affect those vernal pools?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. The vernal pools are to a large extent predicated on winter snow. They need that's where the moisture is going to come from. I mean, also the spring rains as well. But it is that collection of moisture. It's that thawing of snow melt that pools in temporary bodies of water that is creating those unique habitats for amphibians. And as I said, the wood frog, they rely solely on vernal pools for breeding. They do not go to permanent bodies of water. The same could be said for the blue and spotted salamander and just the regular spotted salamander as well. But other species of amphibians can also take advantage of vernal pools as well. So in terms of being able to create vernal pools, you want snow melt. Which means you want snow. And so the more the snow, it's eventually going to melt. And if it, usually that lines up pretty well with the first warm spring rains, then you have good conditions for vernal pools and for habitat for these species of frogs. And so so in terms of you can probably have two. Probably not. If you don't have enough snow, that's probably going to be a problem. If you have too much snow, it might just take a little bit longer for all of it to melt. But again, that's the fuel for the vernal pool to come into existence in the first place. And so that water is what these frogs are relying upon.
Great. We had a question about kind of some interspecies interaction. So somebody asked, can bullfrogs survive in the same country pond if there's a resident muskrat or similar species?
Yeah, well, certainly muskrats have been known to prey upon frogs. But they do occupy, the same generalized habitats. So they do, while they do definitely, one might feed on the other, they also, again, they occupy the same space. So they'll definitely will find them in the same area. And, frogs have, some get eaten, but some escape and they continue on. But yeah, they're, particularly bullfrogs, again, as I said, they're very adaptable. Down in Florida, there have been examples of adult bullfrogs eating baby alligators. They're voracious appetites. They find, they're generalists. They can occupy a wide range of, as long as there's enough moisture, they can make do. I would say that the one stipulation with the bullfrog is that their tadpoles can take over a year, sometimes up to 3 years to transform into a frog. So you'll never see a bullfrog tadpole in a vernal pool because, frankly, the vernal pool is not going to be around long enough that would allow a bullfrog to survive. And so they have to occupy permanent bodies of water. So that would be a lake, that would be a permanent pond. But again, when you talk about permanent ponds, you talk about lakes, you're also talking about fish, you're talking about, again, things like muskrats, you're talking about a different range of predators probably than what you're going to find in a vernal pool. But as I said, bullfrogs are also pretty adaptable, and they've to some extent co-evolved with all these other pond species and have found a way to cohabitate in the same environments.
Excellent. I once heard somebody describe a bullfrog tadpole as a swimming pickle, which I think is a very good description.
That's a good description. Yeah, and they get pretty big. A bullfrog tadpole can, it can be a good, half foot long. Because their big size probably helps them from being predated by smaller fish and things that they're just too big to be a threat or to be threatened by some of the smaller predators out there, which is unlike the wood frog tadpoles. Their tadpoles are maybe an inch, probably closer to ½ inch in size. So they're would be much more susceptible to a larger range of predators than a bullfrog tadpole.
Gotcha. We've had a few folks ask just about the lifespans of frogs, and are there some frogs that live longer than others?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've heard of bullfrogs living up to maybe 7 or 8 years in captivity. I think wood frogs, have the shortest lifespan, as I recall, maybe like a year and a half to 2.5 years. So I would say, depending on the species, you're probably ranging between about 2 years and about 7 or 8 years, depending on the species. There are other frogs that live in other parts of the world. Like I've heard that like an African bullfrog can live for as long as 15 or 20 years. But for most species, it tends to be a little bit shorter lifespan. And I think that also they're pretty fecund. They breed in mass numbers, knowing that many of them are not going to make it. They're going to get predated by a variety of things, and that's kind of their survival strategy is going more by numbers than by holding on to a fewer number of offspring, and then having them have true longevity. But a good 7-year run is not bad if you're a bullfrog. So I would say anywhere about that 2 to 7 year, roughly speaking, about lifespan for an adult. And certainly many do not make it out of the tadpole stage, and many don't make it much out of the froglet stage. That is if you make it all the way to die by old age.
Excellent. A timing question about when frogs lay their eggs. What time of year do they generally lay their eggs, and do all species lay them typically in spring?
That's a really good question. And the answer is no, they're kind of staged them out. The first frogs to come out of brumation in the early spring are going to be the wood frogs, quickly followed by the spring peepers. They're going to be taking advantage of those vernal pools. And as I said, they need to take advantage of those vernal pools because they're not going to be around for too long. And so they need to give those tadpoles enough time to develop those limbs and lungs to get out of there. And then as we go a little bit further into the year, then you'll start hearing the calls and the breeding of leopard frogs and pickerel frogs. And the gray tree frog will come in the kind of later spring. The American toad will start coming in the later spring, and I think the bullfrog is one of the last species to call and to breed, and also the mink frog as well, because they're up in the northern part of Maine, where frankly, it just the spring thaws is a little bit slower up there, and so those are probably going to be the last species to be breeding. So it kind of ranges somewhere between, I would say, late March, early April with the spring peeper and the wood frog, and then kind of going out till kind of early midsummer with the mink frog and the bullfrog on the other end of the spectrum.
Excellent. Some questions about people and frogs. So here's a question: is it harmful to handle frogs and toads? And do you have a recommended technique if it's the age-old summer activity of going out and catching frogs and toads? What's the best practices for that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And probably the best rule of thumb is to handle frogs the least amount as possible, because your hands, they have oils. They have, if you wash your hand, you may have, soap residue. We put our hands through a lot of different things, a lot of different chemicals over the course of our day. And again, frogs, very sensitive skin. That stuff can get right through their skin. So I actually even have a few frogs in the greenhouse next to my classroom, which I'll bring out for different presentations. And I really only handle them when I'm cleaning their cages, but I try not to hold them too much for all of those reasons. And I would recommend, if you ever are to hold a frog, I would definitely try to wash your hands, try to get any soap as possible before handling them. Handle them as again only when necessary. And in terms of like a bullfrog, probably the best, if you are going to hold one, the best way to hold one is to kind of clamp it right around their with their hind limbs. That way they can't use those limbs to jump out of your hand. So that's a good way to hold them without them escaping. So yeah, so I think that, you know, they're unfortunately the sensitivity of their skin does not make it as conducive for holding as other species. But if you do it on a limited basis, you'll probably be okay. But just make sure that your hands are as clean as possible. And then also after holding frogs, it's probably good to go ahead and wash your hands afterward as well.
Excellent. A question about how to foster great frog habitat on your property.
Yeah, well, that is a good question, and part, you know, as we talked about, that you know, a lot of frogs have seen declines because of habitat loss. The good news is that you can create habitat for frogs as well, and probably goes without saying, it means making a pond. And as I said earlier on in my talk here this evening, that we developed a frog pond in our yard. It was just like, you know, 7 feet by 8 foot. I mean, it's not very big. And you know, it's that old adage, if you build it, they will come. And the frogs came in that little pond. I have seen wood frogs. I've seen spring peepers. I've seen American toads. I've seen green frogs. I've even seen an occasional bullfrog come in there, and so yeah, I've seen eggs, and I've seen tadpoles, and you know, and then you start to see you know, insects that will come in there, and you know, and you know, dragonflies and other insects will go there to breed and have habitat, and you know, it develops into its own ecosystem. So yeah, if you can create habitat for frogs, and frogs will find it. You know, if there's a great place for them, they're gonna make it work. So yeah, you can definitely do it. You just have to I think you probably want to have it probably a minimum of about 2 feet in depth. You want it to have nicely lined, and so that you know, so the water you know, doesn't leak out. But yeah, you could definitely do it. You probably want to put in some aquatic plants. You want to use native plants as much as possible. So things like cattails and marsh marigolds, and you know, we certainly have you know, fragrant water lilies. There are different species that we have that you can use to help create that habitat for them, and then just let nature take its course from there. Yeah, I remember one summer looking into my little 7 foot by 8 foot frog pond, and I think I counted almost 20 green frogs in there in midsummer. And earlier in the spring, I was hearing the kind of the duck-like quack of the wood frogs. And so yeah, so you kind of hear the different stages of the frogs that play out at different times of the spring and summer season.
Excellent. Any resources that you might recommend for folks? I know you mentioned the Frog Sounds app. I know one book that I really enjoy using is the Maine Amphibians and Reptiles.
That is a great guide. Yes.
That book. Any other ones, either online or books that folks might be interested in checking out?
I would say if there is one guide just on Maine reptiles and amphibians, I would go with that. The main the main guide, reptiles and amphibians, probably goes without saying. I would say if there's one kind of overall general guide that's pretty darn good, it is the Kaufman Field Guide to Nature of New England. And I mean, it's got, let's see here. I mean, it's got all the, you know, it's got all the species that we have here in the state of Maine. It shows their ranges. habitat, these kinds of things. You know, so this is actually just, if you want a one-shot guide, that also includes obviously, you know, all the other flora, fauna, geology of Maine, that's and New England. I would say that Kaufman Field Guide to the Nature of New England is a really, really good guide as well.
And then just because we're just past 7 o'clock, I'll end on a fun question here. If you can answer it, what is your favorite frog or toad in Maine?
Oh boy. Well, as I said, my nieces and nephews call me Uncle Bullfrog, so I'm probably partial to bullfrogs. But you know, it's interesting when, but I'd probably also say the wood frog. When I used to live in Colorado, and the North America, the wood frog, there's this kind of small disjunct part of its range is found in central Colorado. And I wanted to, at that, when I lived in Colorado, I'd never seen a wood frog. And so I would make this 3-hour drive every spring to try to find one. And it's in a very, very isolated range that they have. And I think I did this like 7 years in a row. I never found a wood frog because they're pretty hard to find in that state. And then I remember right after we moved to Maine, I almost stepped on one in my own front yard. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a wood frog. And now they're pretty common. So that, you know, I just think that they come out so early in the spring, and I love their little duck quack call that they make. So probably somewhere between those two would probably be my favorites.
Excellent. All right. Well,
yeah.
I think that about wraps it up. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you again, Bryce, for sharing all your excellent information.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks everyone, and have a great evening.
Yes, y'all take care.